What's going on, guys? Thanks so much for tuning in. Today is the final installment of Mastering the Squat, Bench, and Deadlift with Paul Oneid. If you haven't checked out the previous episodes, I'd highly recommend you checking them out. These are meant to stand alone, so you don't need to see them. But if you're serious about improving all three lifts, it's a really, really fantastic resource. So first off, Paul, thanks for jumping on again and finishing off the series.
Thanks, man. Thank you for having me. This has been really fun so far, and I think this is probably going to be the most interesting one.
Yeah, so I want to start off with basically talking about the difference between sumo and conventional, because this is something that a lot of people, aka Darrell, hate on and just talk a lot of shit about. And but anyways, I want to set a couple things straight about some of the differences, the muscular contributions, differences in anthropometrics, individual strength, things like that. So what are the primary differences between those two, and how would you identify whether or not someone's going to be maybe predisposed to being better at one than the other?
So, the primary difference is quite easy to see. Like in the sumo deadlift, you're going to have a wide foot stance and a grip inside of the feet. Conventionally, you're going to have a narrow foot stance, hands outside of the feet. The primary difference anthropometrically, I wouldn't look so much there as I would just into the natural tendencies of the lifter. I'm a big fan of having beginner lifters pull both styles. Whereas with an elite level lifter, you need to base your decision making a lot more on dynamic correspondence. So is my energy best spent doing exercise A or exercise B? The answer is whichever carries over to your main lift. With a younger lifter, they're still learning how to move their body through space. They're still trying to develop, general physical preparedness. The more different patterns that they can become proficient in, the better they will be. Not only that, like sumo deadlift is going to really strengthen the hips. Even if it's done with submaximal weights, you're still going to get a good carryover there in terms of hip strength. And then with conventional deadlift, you're going to get a really, really strong back. So my number one recommendation is don't try to fit a square peg into a round hole. If the lifter has a very hard time pulling sumo and they just don't feel comfortable with it, let them pull conventional and vice versa. When we look at the actual shape of the body, sumo deadlifters will tend to have longer torsos, shorter femurs. Conventional deadlifters typically think of that like long-limbed physique, a lot of legs, a lot of arms. They'll be able to start in a higher hip position and keep the bar much closer to that vertical plane of the hip. And essentially that's all that we're looking for when we're looking at which technique is more appropriate. It's in what position can the lifter put themselves in the most advantageous position to move the weight. So from a leverage perspective, I often will get lifters want to experiment with the other lift. If it's a conventional deadlifter, you're going to have a hard time convincing me, especially if it's a conventional deadlifter who's quite proficient at a conventional deadlift. Like if you're pulling 700 pounds plus on conventional and you think that sumo is a good switch for you and you squat narrow, maybe not. But if a sumo, like the sumo deadlift, the way that I coach it, as you know, we're doing quite a bit of conventional work, right? The sumo is pretty much done for technique and position work. And then very sporadically, we'll sprinkle in some heavy singles. But that's just my philosophy on training the sumo deadlift. And I know there's a lot of other ones as well. And that was a very long-winded answer.
No, it definitely makes sense. And as far as like loading strategies, would you have you noticed any sort of differences from like a fatigue or recovery standpoint between the two?
Oh, for sure. So actually, before we move on to fatigue, there's one thing I did want to mention too is the way the lifter squats will give a good indication of whether they will prefer sumo or conventional deadlift because of the shape of the hip socket. So if a lifter prefers a wider stance squat, they likely have a bit more of a shallow hip socket and can externally rotate the knees really well. Someone with a deeper hip socket will not have that same hip rotation capacity and likely will not favor that wide stance deadlift position. And Greg Knuckles actually did a really interesting review looking at the strongest deadlifters and squatters, and overwhelmingly they squatted and deadlifted with similar stances. So those wide stance squatters or moderate stance squatters typically pulled sumo, and vice versa. Narrow stance squatters typically pulled conventional. Now, as far as fatigue goes, you're going to have a much steeper decline in performance as fatigue increases with the sumo deadlift. Reason being is looking at leverages. So in the sumo deadlift, off the floor, your leverages are the worst of the lift. As the bar leaves the floor and the hips start traveling forward, your leverages increase. So with a sumo deadlifter, typically they will either miss falling forward at lockout because they gave up their back off the floor, or they won't be able to break the floor. Conventional, typically they're missing above the knee because that's where the leverages get worse. You're over the bar more. Now, what that means is if the leverages are worse, that means force has to be developed faster to overcome inertia. But if you're fatigued, your rate of force development will drop. So with a sumo deadlift, where your leverages are poor off the floor, if you're fatigued and have poor rate of force development, you're going to have much more variable performances on training days. But you stand to increase your performance if you peak properly. So a lot of my sumo deadlifters tend not to deadlift very heavy during meet prep. And then as soon as it's ready for the meet, they're really fresh and they can go pull a nice heavy single PR. My conventional deadlifters, on the other hand, they'll be able to carry more fatigue into training because their rate of force development will not determine how successful they are in their performance, because leverages are best off the floor. So you're able to break off the floor without as much rate of force development, and then you're going to be able to carry through. It's much more of I would call the conventional deadlift much more of a strength-oriented lift, and the sumo deadlift is way more technical, much more nuanced, very highly dependent on positioning because of that terrible leverage position off the floor.
That's one thing that I think I've seen a lot of people mess up on the sumo deadlift, especially since I started working with you. Like for me, I just thought it was that I had shitty hip mobility. And I mean, partly that's true, obviously. But, you know, with the more that I'm working on it, the more that I'm seeing like, oh, okay, like eventually I'll be able to get into these much, much better positions. And a lot of the times, like you were saying, there's those kind of two types of lifters where they miss it. Either it's like it doesn't break the floor or they miss it kind of at the top. And I've seen a lot of lifters give up their upper back just to get the bar moving.
Right.
And then it ends up turning into this like, you know, sumo stance conventional deadlift. And you can see the leverages are like almost the same as the conventional at the top. It's like their shoulders are way over the bar, their hips are fired up, and they're like super far back. And like, what are some of the things that you use to cue someone outside of just being like, hey, you gotta be more patient off the floor and just hold the position?
There's a few things that I'll teach. Number one is making sure that they are in a really good position already. So we'll cue positioning, we'll cue hips to the bar, we'll cue chin back, we'll cue armpits closed to engage the lats. Then from an exercise, I'm, as you know, I'm very big on letting the exercise teach versus just me using my words, right? So a movement that forces the lifter to be in perfect position, something like a library deadlift, which is a slow, controlled, eccentric sumo deadlift with a light touch and go. Okay. And by a light touch and go, I mean, like, we're in a library. I don't want to hear the plates touch the ground. That forces them to be in the most high tension positions on the eccentric. Eventually they learn and build resilience in those positions and they can achieve them off the floor. Things like pump fake deadlifts, where you will pull your first pull to the knee, make sure that you're in good position, pause, drop, full deadlift. Then there's also the, for lifters who use a dynamic start, so who will start with the hips high and then swing them in as they pick up their chest, I'll take that away from them. I'll say static start sumo deadlift. So force them to get tension out of the bar without that dynamic start. And that will also help to improve the positioning of the hips off the floor.
Yeah, that's one thing I've seen a lot from, because I'm not exactly sure why, but I've coached quite a few guys from Westside,
Yep.
like who were using that style of training,
Yep.
and they like to do everything really, really explosively. And so I'd have to like slow them down and be like, hey, look, like you're already fast, you're already really powerful. We're not gaining anything from that. You got to really just like be patient, dial things in, and focus on your technique, because that's like you're losing like 50 pounds in your deadlift or squat. Well, actually, not the squat, but mostly just the deadlift. By
Yeah. Yes and no, because they might be like, if they hit that dynamic start perfect, they might have a huge lift. But the inconsistency of the dynamic start is where they have the issue.
Yeah, and that's what I'm talking about, right? Like you look at someone like Dan Green or Caller Willem, and it's like, well, they do a dynamic start. It's like, yeah, but all their deadlifts look the same,
Yes.
right? And so for most people, they're not at that level of like technical proficiency where I'm like, that's fine to do. I usually explain it like this. I'm like, look, that's fine to do. There's nothing wrong with that. I think both are appropriate, but if you can't preserve your technique, that ends up being a weakness, at least for the time being. You know?
So what I would do in that instance, and like Stuart, someone who lifts with a dynamic start. So for all of Stuart's technique work, I have him do a static start. Whenever we're pulling heavy, I'll allow him to use that dynamic start. Reason being, I'm reinforcing his positioning and that mental cue of where his hips need to be in space with the position work, so that he ends up being more consistent on the heavy stuff. The other thing I'll do is, with sumo, I use a lot of blocks. And the reason I use a lot of blocks is removing that bottom 2 to 4 inches of the range of motion allows you to really reinforce that hip close to the bar, knees out, head tall positioning, so that you know what it feels like with heavier weights in your hands. And then when the bar goes on the floor, if we've been working on our positioning off the floor and our rate of force development with some speed work, it carries over really, really well.
So what kind of blocks are you looking at in terms of the height? Like 2 inches, 4 inches?
2 to 4. So like closer to a meet, we'll go 2. Further out, we'll go 4, just for specificity purposes. And then, so like how training with a sumo deadlifter might look is, so week 1, they may do a heavy set off of the blocks and then some technique work off the floor. Something like, a heavy triple from the blocks, then put the bar on the floor, 3 sets of 3 pump fakes. Then the next week, they would do some speed work from the floor, some singles, low rest periods, and then we would cycle through that. As they got more proficient, we could lower the height of the blocks. We could change that positioning drill to an actual like pause deadlift. And then eventually, as we get closer to the meet, 1 or 2 weeks of heavier singles from the floor just to practice, even just one, right? Pull a heavy single at an 8. The next week you deload. That heavy single is your opener. You open with that at the meet. Done. Could be that simple.
So why do you assume, or why do you think that there's such a difference between like squat and deadlift? And I guess maybe you don't assume that, but what I mean by that is like, it seems like you need more exposure, frequent exposure to something like the squat from a technical standpoint to feel comfortable under it, versus I know the conventional deadlift, I've seen people who don't even deadlift more than once every 2 weeks, and they're like very good at it, and they don't seem to have any sort of like technical regression. But then even between that and like the sumo deadlift, have you noticed any difference in terms of like being able to preserve that technique without doing the specific movement, even if you like, I know you're doing it off blocks and things like that, but you kind of get what I'm saying?
I do. So what I would say is, I think the reason most people can get away with conventional deadlifting less often is because the conventional deadlift will carry more fatigue into the rest of your training because the lower back is taxed more. Typically, the more lower back intensive a movement is, the less often you can touch it, or the more fatigue it'll carry through. So typically the less volume you can train it with. Whereas we have the squat, which for the most part, unless you're a really bent over squatter, isn't going to terribly crush your lower back. And the loads tend to be a little bit lighter for most people, right? Like for myself, my squat and deadlift are very similar. So I can't necessarily play by the same rules. Hopefully my deadlift comes up. But in that situation, you have to look at where are the needs of the lifter, what data have you carried through, and what can you show as like something that's really beneficial for them. I know for me, I really like a 2 squat a week approach, with that secondary squat being quite light, just like a light exposure. For deadlifting, I'll deadlift once a week and then have a supplementary deadlift movement, usually a stiff leg or a Romanian deadlift as my second exposure. It doesn't have to get more fancy than that. I think the reason a lot more people can get away with not conventional deadlifting as often is simply because it is more of like a brute strength kind of movement. It's not as technically intensive. That being said, I think there's a lot of carryover from a conventional deadlift from things like stiff legs and Romanians. So you don't necessarily have, like, those would be, 1 degree of separation away from a conventional deadlift, right? Because all you're changing is the height of the hip. Whereas with a sumo deadlift, it is much more technically intensive. So you would tend to need and tend to tolerate more exposures because it's not as taxing on the low back because you're in that upright posture. And you need to be in proper position in order to break the floor. So the more refined your positioning can be, the more exposures you have with it, the better you're going to be able to display your strength.
So it's more that the technical SRA curve lines up with just your recovery timeline than it is just technique is preserved for longer kind of thing. Or that's sort of like what you.
I would tend to agree with that statement. I don't. And the thing is that SRA curve is going to be different for every person. Like a Dan Green or a Kaylor Woolham. Like Kaylor doesn't pull sumo during his off season at all. If he does, it's really light speed work, which for him is enough to preserve his technique. Whereas Dan will pull sumo almost every week. And actually, most weeks he'll pull sumo. It's just what lifters have found that they do best with. And this is where, as a coach, as you're coaching someone, you need to be taking in these cues that they're giving you. Hey, my hips feel this. With a sumo deadlifter, you're going to have, hey, my hips feel a little beat up. With a conventional deadlifter, you're like, hey, I'm carrying a lot of low back fatigue into my squats. That's what I see the most. So you have to make sure that you have enough recovery between squats and deadlifts. You have to make sure that you have enough exposures that you're able to continuously improve technique. And you have to make sure that the volume is appropriate, that you're not carrying in too much fatigue to the next session or to the next deadlift session. Notice I said enough. Like, that's all you need is enough. I think people try to do too much. I was actually listening to the Lex Friedman podcast, and he had George St. Pierre on, which in itself was friggin' hilarious because his French accent is so bad. He was talking about artificial intelligence, and every time he said AI, he said, hey, hi. And he said, instead of Vladimir Putin, he said Vladimir Putin. And I was dying. But George St. Pierre, one of the questions was, what advice would you give a younger fighter? And he said, you do too much. And I think that's a big hole that we're falling into, and that I fell victim to in the past as well. All you need is enough.
Yeah, that was something that I was really, really shocked by. And even just like on some of the deadlift sessions that I've been doing lately, like I'll work up to a single top set of sumos and then that's it. you know, and then I'll do like maybe 2 sets of like basement RDLs or whatever it might be, or a tempo stiff leg deadlift or whatever it is. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh, this is super easy. And then I do it and I'm like, oh shit, that was hard.
I'm really fucked up.
But then like I don't feel banged up all the time.
Yeah.
You know?
One thing that's been
was really
interesting,
surprising to me.
one thing that's been interesting with your training is, well, we started at 5 days and then you started feeling beat up. So we reduced the total volume and it worked really well. And then you started feeling a little bit beat up again. So we took it to 4 days and then you've been doing really, really well with 4 days. And then as the weights got heavier, you're like, hey, I'm starting to get beat up again. So we took the volume down a little bit more and then you started to get even better. So it's been this perpetual state of like trying to find the appropriate amount of volume where you're able to have really, really high outputs, but still recover for the next session. And it's something that I've been trying to find myself as well. Like right now I have 3 squat exposures a week. One of them is 1 set of split squats, 1 set of leg press, and then 1 or 3 sets of squats. That's it. Those are my 3 exposures. And honestly, my body has never felt better. So it begs the question of, as you get more refined in your technique and you get more skillful in your execution, how much volume do you really need to progress forward? I don't think much. I think all you need is the appropriate stimulus in terms of loading, and then the appropriate amount of rest in between exposures. And that takes time to develop. But I'm enjoying playing with, I know this is a deadlift conversation, but I'm really enjoying finding for people what that appropriate amount of work is for the desired outcome. Because ultimately, the lighter you can go and still make progress, the longer your lifting career is going to be. And the stronger you are at the end of your lifting career is going to be dependent on how many regressions you can avoid, right? The person who lifts the most consistently for the longest period uninjured is going to be the one who's the strongest at the end.
Yeah. And so this is actually a conversation I had with one of my athletes recently, right? Is a lot of the stuff that I do is like RIR based. And, you know, I use kind of a combination of RIR and percentages. But one of the things that I found is a lot of the times, like, people try and force progression or force adaptation, where it's like,
they chase numbers.
Yeah. And it's like, it says to RIR. And they're like, yeah, but I did this last week, or I did, you know, less last week. And I'm like, this isn't like a linear progression. It's different, right? It's like, you're not trying to like step it up every single time. Like you kind of are, but if you don't, that's not necessarily the point. And like, I've seen all sorts of different types of progression where some people, and like, I'm generally like this, where I'll see like weekly progress, you know, and it's pretty reliable until it's not. And then I need to make a change. But I've had clients where it's like 2 months go by and they're still lifting the same weights. And then we pivot and all of a sudden their lifts go up like dramatically, you know, and it's just, they just, for some reason, have been like that since I've started with them, you know? And like, I think that is a bit of an obstacle as well. Like when you start chasing those numbers in your deadlift, because then it's like, oh, I need to work harder. And I think that's part of what leads to the additional volume, the additional intensity, and you just end up doing more and more and more, as opposed to doing like just enough. And I also think that that's a big problem as you get more advanced, because when you're novice, you probably would benefit from a little bit more volume and a little bit less.
Agreed. Yes.
Maybe, you know, just to get
more practice,
more exposure. Yeah. And like build some muscle mass. But then, you know, someone like yourself, you filled out your weight class, you're muscular, you've got a good body composition. I don't know how much more you're going to get from doing tens on conventional deadlift. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. And that's kind of a paradigm shift that I've had, is like, I train my competition lifts for technique and for output. I don't use those movements to drive hypertrophy, right? Like, I'm going to do ones to fives on the competition movements. And if I'm going to do sixes, eights, 10s, 12s, 15s, it's on a machine or it's on something that has some sort of external stability. But you talk about, chasing numbers. I just had this conversation with a lifter today. It's like the whole point of an RPE system is that if you're feeling fatigued and your plan says RPE 7, but last week you hit 500 at an RPE of 7, and this week you're like, oh, well, I'm going to go 520. It's like, yeah, but maybe your RPE of 7 this week is 440, 60 pounds off. We can look at why, but if you continue to push and overshoot your RPE, all you're doing is carrying additional fatigue forward rather than following the plan, getting the appropriate exposure to the appropriate intensity, and then hopefully dissipating enough fatigue after the fact to get back on track. All we've done now is, if we're overshooting, we're just digging our hole deeper and deeper. And the concept of, oh, if I'm underperforming, I need to add volume on the back end of the workout. Or if I'm underperforming, the whole plan is in the shitter. Or if I'm underperforming, I'm not going to be where I want to be when I want to be there. And it's like, no, you're underperforming because of some reason that we need to dive into. But that doesn't mean that the plan has to change today. If you follow the plan and you hit your RPE 7 top set, and then you finish the workout, maybe it's, in your opinion, too light to generate an adaptation. But the whole point of an RPE system is to respect relative intensity. If you keep chasing absolute intensity, if you keep chasing numbers, you're going to get beaten to the ground, and that's when you get hurt.
Yeah, and then even beyond that too, right? Like, the one thing that I've noticed is if you fudge your numbers up, it makes it really hard to know what's going wrong, because it's like, okay, I'm looking at your program and I'm like, okay, so if we assume that he's hitting these reasonably accurately, this is supposed to be, a 7 RPE, this is supposed to be an 8, this is supposed to be a whatever. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, I don't really see anything drastically different than what we've been doing previously. But then in reality, the 7's actually like an 8.5. The 8 is more of like a 9.5 or a 10. Right. And so it makes it very difficult to identify, okay, where's this problem actually coming from and how do we solve it? And I've seen people go into that. I don't generally think I have that as a problem. I generally tend to undershoot a little bit, which I've actually found to be a little bit more beneficial. But even things like, I've also seen athletes too, where let's say I say triple at a 7 or something like that, and they'll hit a triple and they're like, I think I should have maybe added like 5 more kilos. So I'm going to add 5 more kilos and do it again. I'm just like, dude, 5 more kilos is not going to make a huge difference. And you've just doubled your stimulus for the day. You know what I mean? Like exactly. That's so much excessive fatigue that we didn't account for initially. So fuck it, hit it next week or the week after or whatever it is. And that's easy to communicate, but hard to understand, I think, for some people sometimes. Fuck, even for myself,
we all go through challenges. Like, I squatted heavy for the first time this weekend in probably a year. And I was like, okay, I'm going to hit a top single at 7. And I go and I'm like, it probably is going to be around 600. So I take 600 and I'm like, oh, that was pretty easy. So I take 640. I'm like, wow, that was really easy too. I'm going to try and go 6. What did I think I was going to squat? I thought I loaded 683. And I smoked it. And I'm like, okay, sweet. And then I realized it was 694. I was like, okay, well, even better. And I'm like, that wasn't a 7. But you know what? I don't need to go heavier than that right now. I called it. So it's like, I'm 16 weeks out from my competition. Do I need to be squatting 7 plus right now? No, I need to be squatting 832 in 16 weeks. So we need to have this long-term mindset there. Like, yes, you want to strike while the iron's hot and follow the plan. So if your RPE 7s are moving, you push the load on them as much as you can, but in the same breath, it's like, you're not going to get stronger in one training session. You get stronger with the aggregate of marginal gains is how you get stronger. But you can absolutely fuck up your whole shit in one session. One bad session can screw up your entire training cycle. You tragically hurt yourself, you're done. You strain a muscle, 3 weeks, right? But if you adhere to the plan and maybe undershoot a little bit, you train tomorrow.
Yeah, no, 100%. And that's a hard thing to keep in the forefront of your mind. I think it only happens after you've kind of gone through all that, like being injured and all that stuff. So you're like, you know what, I'm just gonna, do my best to stick to the program. Because for me too, like I used to always want to push really, really hard in the gym, and like my training sessions are hard and I do work hard and stuff like that. But
Yep.
at the same time, there's like, I don't think it makes any sense. Even I'll be talking to my athletes about it, where they're like, "Oh yeah, like I want to feel comfortable hitting what I'm going to hit on the platform," and I'm like, "Why? Like if you're hitting in the gym what you're going to hit on the platform, what's the point of competing? You know what I mean? You should be doing more." So it's like, I don't know. It's like you go in and you hit heavy stuff enough, so you're like, okay, I know that I have more in the tank, but you don't kill yourself right before a meet, so that you're just doing what you could do in the gym.
The way I used to do it was I would use like a 1 rep max calculator, because I found that it was actually like, anecdotes here, right? I found that it was actually quite predictive for me. So it's like, if I want to squat 804, I got to squat 750 for a double. So then that would be my last heavy squat workout. And then I'd walk into the meet being like, I can fucking squat 804 already. And it worked every single time. I never used to take heavy singles in training.
Yeah.
Now I use that heavy single in the same way, because I kind of know how much I have left in the tank. So I'll be like, all right, that moved really well. I probably have, 30, 40 pounds left. And then that's the idea. So like the last meet I did in wraps, I ended up I think I squatted 777. That video that you called me out on today. My last heavy session of that meet prep, I squatted 765. And it was really good. I knew I could have squatted 800 that day, but I had just torn my quad like a year prior. So I was like, that was my comeback meet. So I got to the meet, smoked 750 something on my second. And I was like, I'm just going to go 777. I'm going to smoke it and they'll be done. But on that day, I knew, I'm like, okay, well, I could do 800. Like, I'm fine. So that was my idea of saving it for the next day. Little did I know, 4 years down the road, haven't been able to take a shot at that again until now. But that's all to say. We need to get to a place where we look at our training, whether it's squat, bench, or deadlift, as a means of what is the appropriate amount of work that I need to do here? Where am I going to devote my energy? If you're a sumo deadlifter, your energy should be focused on on speed and positions. So rate of force development and positions. If you're a conventional deadlifter, your goal should be getting your back as strong as possible and learning how to wedge into the bar. That's it, right? If you can address those areas with those lifts, you will develop some significant proficiency. I would say as a conventional deadlifter, you'll want to be going heavier more often in the conventional deadlift. With the sumo deadlift, you'll want to go heavier less frequently, but you'll want to have more frequent exposures to deadlifting. And then if you're a sumo deadlifter as well, your main assistance exercise for the sumo deadlift should be a conventional deadlift of some sort. Because the stronger your back is, the better your positioning will be with the hips off the floor.
Yeah, I found that one thing that has been challenging for a handful of athletes that I've coached to the sumo deadlift has been like the wedge, obviously, and generating impulse initially. Specifically their brace. Like I find they kind of get into a little bit too much extension, and
Yes.
they lose that like ribs over pelvis position.
Yep.
And then a lot of the times that's also when they start getting that hip pain. And that was even something you cued me more for the squat, but I actually found that doing something similar for the deadlift actually helped quite a bit. And
Yep.
so is there anything that you focus on to help improve the bracing for the sumo, especially because there is that kind of time where you're generating impulse? And I guess for guys who don't know what impulse is, it's like it's force over time, which is why you'll see someone pull on a sumo deadlift for like maybe a second or two, and then it breaks off the ground.
So one thing that I try to cue is when you're in the wedge position, you're trying to make your torso as short as possible. So driving those armpits to your hips, closing them off. So you're engaging those lats, making your torso small, pulling the ribs to the pelvis, not going into a posterior tilt per se, but definitely getting a little bit of flexion out of that thoracic spine. Then as you're wedging in, you're trying to get the thoracic spine to extend. And the way I cue that is with the chin back. So I'll say, drive that chin back. Think about being a puppet on a string. So the string is pulling the crown of your head to the top of the ceiling. And what that should do, it should preserve pelvic position. Where we're going to see poor pelvic positioning is if the adductors are really weak. Because if the adductors aren't engaged, you'll go into anterior pelvic tilt, which is going to turn off that anterior core and place all of the load into the hamstrings and glutes and lumbar spine. So if we can keep that neutral pelvis, we can keep the adductors engaged and not in a lengthened position. They are very, very strong hip extenders, right? So if my adductors are on and I'm getting more hip extension strength out of them, all I've done to do that is neutralize my pelvic position. That can be done a few different ways. It can be done, as I mentioned, by cueing the torso to be short, chin retracted, head tall, or it could be cued as your intention into the floor. A lot of people will try to really root the feet into the floor and try to like externally rotate the knees as hard as they can. What that's going to do, it's going to roll them onto the outside of the feet. So what you want to do instead is I push the big toe down, and then I try to get them to root from the hip. So to try and open the hip, screw the hip into the floor, and that'll drive the knees a little bit more forward, which we want. That way we have a little bit of quad drive. The hips are slightly closer to the bar, and you can get into a better position. So depending on what the athlete's doing at the foot, it can usually dictate what's happening at the pelvis, usually.
That's a great point. And actually you said something there as well that I've seen pretty commonly, and that's that negative shin angle. So the idea that you need to have like a perfectly vertical shin angle, which, works for some people. But then a lot of the times I've noticed people take it to the extreme where they actually have like a negative where their knees are now like behind the bar almost and sort of like directed inwards, almost like they're kind of internally rotating a little bit. And sometimes that's just because they're a little too wide, but sometimes it's like it's just like a positional thing. Like they're trying to get this like theoretical optimal position, but not necessarily understanding what they're trying to accomplish.
I find that happens when the lifter tries to sit back into the deadlift and turn it into a pull.
Yeah.
Whereas
yeah.
I try to teach the sumo deadlift, especially off the floor, I teach it as a push. So if you're doing a sumo deadlift with relative proficiency, there should be no change in torso angle until until the knees are locked. So think about that for a moment. The hip stays in the same position relative to the vertical plane of the bar. You initiate contact. You call it an impulse, right? So you put impulse into the bar. The hips come forward. They stay vertical because the knees are pushing, the legs are pushing. So the hips stay in a vertical path. And then as soon as the knees lock, then you extend the hip. It happens relatively at the same time, but the knees will lock first. And if that's the case, the listeners can't see me, but that torso angle isn't going to change because the shoulders are staying on top of the barbell the entire time. That's why sumo deadlift, the leverage is increased, because as the hips get closer to the bar, the knees are already extended. And then the hip, then that change in torso angle is very, very small. So these lifters that have incredibly good sumo deadlifts, think of like a Jamal Browner, think of a Kaylor Woolham, Dan Green. If you were to watch their deadlift from the side, their torso angles don't change until the knees are locked because they're already vertical.
Yeah. So one thing I also notice that's fairly common is, and you mentioned this earlier, kind of at the beginning, is people losing their upper back position, which ends up costing them the lift once they get past the knees for conventional. I've seen that pretty commonly.
Yeah.
But I've also seen that like doing direct back work doesn't necessarily do as much as you would maybe think. And I like utilizing maybe like, let's say, snatch grip deadlifts and some other stuff. But like, I was just wondering, what are some things that you have found to be reasonably effective to help mitigate that?
So one thing that I try to teach for conventional deadlifters is the goal should not be to extend the back. So you're not trying to get into extension of the spine. Again, you're trying to shorten the distance of the torso. So arms long, lats to hips, trying to shorten the distance between the shoulder and like the vertical plane of the barbell, which will be the shoulder, and the hip. Now, one thing that I try to fix is the idea that the thoracic spine needs to be in an extended or even neutral position. Thoracic flexion and conventional deadlift is totally okay, as long as it's a flexed position that's locked with the lats and not a flexed position that results from losing an extended position. So what you'll see sometimes is a lifter try to get into an extended spine. Then as soon as they go to initiate off the floor, their lats will pull down, their mid back will come up, their lower back might stay neutral, it might not, but if they get into that, it's almost like an eccentric loading of the lats. What happens there is you're not able to maintain spinal segmentation. So because the lats are being lengthened, you have no control over when that stops. The spine just keeps flexing. Then you'll get lumbar flexion, and then you can't use the glutes to lock out. That's why you miss. So you lose the upper back, but losing the upper back results in losing the lower back. And then when you lose the lower back, you can't extend the hip. What I try to teach is a slightly rounded thoracic spine and the lats locked in. So when you go to put impulse into the barbell, there is no eccentric lengthening of that tissue because it's already locked down. You're already in a flexed position. You can't get more flexed. And if you're already flexed, you can maintain spinal segmentation. So you'll see if the listeners ever watch me deadlift, they'll see me round my upper back as I reach for the floor, and then I lock my lats in and I keep that position. So my lower back is neutral, but my thoracic spine is flexed. And then at lockout, I don't have to do anything with my upper body to extend my thoracic spine, because as I bring my hips through, I'm standing tall. When you see people try to like extend their back at lockout, it's because their glutes can't work and they have to use the erectors to lock out the lift.
That one's always so sketchy to me. It just feels like you're trying to smush your spine through.
I hate the usually see it with female lifters where they'll go to initiate off the floor, and if you're watching from the front, their belt will disappear because there's so much flexion. And then as they lock out, the belt just goes boop, and it's like their lower back just snaps through. That always makes me cringe.
Yeah, there's a couple of those that are a little freaky. Man,
that being said, like a little bit of flexion isn't going to be the end of the world, right? We know that neutral is a range. So the goal is whatever position that you start the back in off the floor, it maintains through the deadlift. You don't want to be starting in a position and then flexing more. You want to lock whatever position you're in as you complete the lift.
Mm.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's all good. So assuming you do that and it's still at a point where, you know, the cueing has worked a bit, but it's not quite as effective as maybe you'd want, and you kind of gave it a reasonable shot, let's say like a month or two or something like that. Where would you go from there?
Like the lifter still is having trouble with back positioning.
Yeah, like it's improved, but it's like it only improved to a certain point, and there's still a reasonable amount of like energy leakage.
Big RDL guy, very big RDL guy. I love using the RDL to teach the hinge, especially if you're doing the RDL properly. All you're missing is a very slight touch to the floor, and then you're doing conventional deadlift. The other thing I would use is a stiff leg deadlift from a deficit, really using the lats to initiate off the floor. So teaching the lifter to initiate that stiff leg deadlift by pulling the shoulders to the hips. And that will teach them bracing for sure to keep that low back neutral. And you know what? I do a lot of core work. Like there's core work programmed every day for my athletes, some type of core work. For the deadlift, I'm a big fan of any type of core work that involves the hip flexors. So we're talking about hanging leg raises or knee raises, GHR sit-ups, any type of like dragonflies, anything that's going to involve the hip flexors within the abdominal training is going to be really effective for building starting position resilience in the deadlift.
Why is that?
Well, so if your hip flexors aren't strong and engaged, you're going to have, how do I put this? So hip stability is a combination of factors, right? So you have multiple muscles acting on the pelvis. So the abdominal muscles are going to be really, really involved in that anterior oblique sling. So your obliques into the opposite adductor. Then with the posterior oblique sling, you have lat, glute, QL. Now, if there is a leak anywhere in that chain, right? So if say the lats aren't engaged, that psoas and that rec fem, that's going to be kind of it's almost like the floodgate. It's like the last line of defense. So if that's really strong, because right, the hips are going to be extending as you lift. So the more contraction you can get out of them in the bottom, I personally find the more you can integrate them into bracing, the more stable your bottom position is going to be. That's what I found. Now, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who don't agree with me, but when you're talking about being in a flexed hip position, the hip flexors help you maintain position in the flexed hip.
Wrong. Yeah.
Just one of those things I'm trying to explain it in a way where everyone will understand. And that's really all it is. When you look at the musculature of the hip, like the way in which the pelvis is stabilized, it makes sense to integrate everything within what you're trying to do. So if we're trying to train a flexed hip position, we need to train the abdominals in a flexed hip position.
Mm-hmm. So I kind of wanted to open up to you then and just see what your thoughts were in terms of some of the bigger things that you see that are maybe misunderstood, or some of the things that are maybe missed when discussing the deadlift, when practicing the deadlift, when peaking the deadlifts, anything really that you think is pertinent to discuss that we haven't already touched on. This has been a little bit more of a different conversation than the previous one.
I would say that the thing that I see messed up the most or improperly implemented is being true to the intent of what you're trying to do with the movement. So I routinely see people doing like sets of 6 to 8 on a paused deadlift, or um, multiple like heavy long sets of deadlifting. If the goal is technical proficiency, we should be training within a rep range that is heavy enough to perform the lift without technical breakdown, right? So it needs to be heavy enough that we need to put force into it, but light enough that we can preserve technique. If your goal is to improve positioning, doing a lift to a point of fatigue that positioning cannot be maintained doesn't make sense, right? So if I'm doing a pause deadlift set of 6 reps, it's either going to be so light that it won't matter until the last couple of reps, or it's going to be so heavy that I can't perform the lift properly for the prescribed amount of reps, and then my position breaks down. So I'm just getting stronger in shit positions. Whereas if you keep the rep range lower, you can go heavy enough that it's hard, but because you're not accumulating as much fatigue during the repetitions, you can maintain the integrity of your positions. Just because you're getting tired doesn't mean you're getting better. The other thing we know too is that barbell lifts that are internally stabilized, done for high repetitions, are going to be more centrally fatiguing. They're going to fatigue the central nervous system to a greater degree than heavier weights for lighter sets, for lower amounts of reps. So it would stand to reason that a set like that would carry fatigue more than a heavier set done for less reps. So if a heavier set done for less reps accumulates less central fatigue and allows us to maintain our positioning while putting enough force into the bar to make it challenging, it would stand to reason that that would be a superior implementation. Now, the other thing that I see is a very over reliance on barbell movements to train the back. Like if you're using a barbell to do deadlifts, stiff leg deadlifts, then barbell rows, your back is going to be really fucking tired when it comes to squat in a couple days. If you're already training the erectors through the deadlift, through the stiff leg deadlift, get on a machine, train the lats, train the mid back. That's honestly like the underutilization of machines or chest supported variations startles me. I've never personally gotten much out of barbell rows. Like I can row well over 400 pounds for reps. I don't really think it carries over to my deadlift. It looks cool. I post it on Instagram sometimes. But I think we stand to benefit a lot more from supporting the chest, isolating the musculature of the back, primarily, those rhomboids, those mid back extensors, the lats. We get a lot more work done with those machines, and then we can integrate them on the main lift. And again, we're talking about fatigue carryover. If I'm doing a barbell row that's internally stabilized, that means that I'm carrying more fatigue. Typically, I'm going to be doing more repetitions. So if I can accumulate less fatigue and get more of a stimulus on the target muscle, I'm going to use machines, and it's going to be better for me long term.
Yeah, that's actually honestly something that I've changed my mind quite a bit on this. I'd say over the last year is the how much volume do you actually need, and it's still something I find myself going back and forth on to really find like where I stand on that, or like not where I stand, but maybe an effective solution. Because I used to do a lot of volume, and I found that got me very strong, and but obviously stronger
Also got you very injured.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the stronger you get, the more damage you're doing to yourself, and so I think it's tricky, right? And I was again just so incredibly surprised at how little volume I'm doing now, relatively speaking. I mean, a couple months before I started working with you, I remember I did 6 sets of 10 deficit deadlifts with 500. You know what I mean? It was like,
but you still couldn't pull 700.
Exactly. That's my point. Right.
Right. So then my question is like, is that actually making you stronger? Or is that just making you better at pulling 500 for reps up a deficit?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
from a conceptual framework, I always come back to this idea of meaningful repetitions. So meaningful repetitions are going to be the repetitions that either lead to adaptation or that lead to adaptation. So for strength, we know that needs to be over 80%. We need to be, around that, RPE 7 to 8 range, likely to get the best adaptations. It's going to be heavy enough that we can maintain technique, light enough that we don't carry over too much fatigue. When we look at hypertrophy, well, we know that internal stability creates more central fatigue. We know that high repetitions create more central fatigue. So if we're going to be doing higher repetition sets, we should eliminate the need for internal stability, right? Because that's going to mitigate some of the fatigue you carry through. Then you have to look at, okay, can I get this done with less reps? Which is why that idea of hypertrophy taking place between 6 and 12, right? Because that seems to be the happy place where we can lift weights heavy enough that they don't fuck us up, and heavy enough that we get a stimulus, and light enough that we don't fuck ourselves up. When we eliminate internal stability and go external stability, that's when we can focus on output. That's when we can focus on, what muscles are under tension, where we're trying to get that hypertrophy stimulus. Using barbell lifts for hypertrophy just conceptually doesn't make sense in the fatigue management model.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was a big part of, like, that was a big realization for me as well, is just like, because, if I hit a new, I don't know, top set of 5 and under top set of 5, 3, 2, 1, whatever it is, like, I know with a pretty high degree of certainty that's going to probably translate to a higher 1RM for me.
Yep.
Right. But then, doing more sets of 10, I'm not convinced that really does anything. And like you said, because there's such a difference. And this is something that, like I said, that I struggled with for a long time, was the understanding that, like, strength is a skill.
Yes.
Like I would look at it as like a physical quality, and I'm like, oh, well, I can lift this for more now. I must be stronger. I'm this, I'm this, and this. And it's like, and that is true conceptually. But then I think once you really, really get a good grasp of what is meant when they say strength is a skill, it completely changes. And it's like, I find that every 3 months I'm looking back at some of these concepts that I thought I understood, and I'm like, oh wow, there's more layers to this, and I mean, as simple as a concept superficially as it is, it's just interesting when you kind of see what that means from a program design execution standpoint, and how that changes and evolves over time.
And now, like, one thing that I will say right off the bat is, like, my programs didn't always look like this, right? Like, I've gone through the same evolution of programming that most people do. I've just been doing it for 16 years, right? So I am where I am. Actually, fuck, it's been longer than that. Old.
You're like 47, 48 now?
Like minimum. Yeah, I got salt and pepper chest hair now.
Well, that's just dignified, though. You're distinguished.
Yeah, fuck, my whole, like, the whole side of my beard is salt and pepper. That's why I keep it short. So I mean, I've gone through this paradigm. I've always believed in hitting heavy sets on my assistance work. So, like, if it was 4 sets of 10, it'd be escalating 4 sets of 10 to one top set. But now looking back, I'm like, well, but if I'm doing 4 sets of 10 and only maybe the last 2 sets were meaningful, why the fuck did I do the first 2 sets of 10? All I did was accumulate fatigue. And I'm like, all right, well, then I'm going to cut those 2 sets out and see what happens. I cut those out, and I did like sets of 2 or 3 as I acclimated to the load. And then not only were my heavy sets heavier, but I wasn't as tired the next day. I was able to train hard. So I was like, okay, well, this makes sense. Now, how little, like, it started with the squat because my knees were so beat up I couldn't volume squat. So like, well, how much squatting do I really need to be able to do? And turns out not that much. So then I was like, well, if that applies to my squat, it should apply to my deadlift as well. And it is to a lesser extent. I still find that I need quite a bit of deadlift volume just because I'm not as proficient in the deadlift. And then with the bench press, same thing, right? I'm not as proficient in the bench press, so I need more practice. And that's kind of the distinguishing factor that I come to is like, the less proficient you are in a movement, likely the more volume you're going to need to perform. But you're going to need to adjust either the exercise selection or the intensity volume relationship to determine how much you actually need to do. I personally have found microdosing my stimulus to be more effective. So right now I'm benching 3 times a week, deadlifting twice, and squatting 3 times. But my squats, as I've said, one's a leg press, one's a squat, one's a split squat, and there's only 5 total sets during the week. So microdosing the stimulus versus having it all on one day.
Yeah. And the one thing that I think it was you that posted this not too long ago was talking about the lack of intensity for assistance work and accessories.
Yeah.
And it's honestly so crazy because like you don't really think about that until you actually start like looking around and seeing what people are doing. And then you're like, oh wow, they're just kind of like, fucking the dog, sort of like they're going through the motions, but it's unlikely that it's going to be heavy enough to actually do anything super meaningful. And if it's not, then they're probably just going to end up doing a bunch of additional volume that's probably unnecessary and accumulating a little bit more fatigue than it is, generating an actual like adaptation.
It's like, why are we doing this? Why are you doing your dumbbell bench press? Why are you doing your dips? Right? Like dips say, I did one top set. I did, I think 145 for a set of 8 because my PR was 8 and I wanted 9. And I missed my 9th rep and I was fucking pissed. So then I went to 88 and I did 17. So, but both of those sets were to absolute muscular failure, right? Then I went to, what did I do after that? Then I went to shoulders. I did some shoulder raises. I did 2 sets to failure. Then I did 3 light sets of tricep extensions and 3 light sets of bicep curls. That was my workout today after buffalo benching. So after my 3 sets of buffalo bench, I did 2 sets of dips, 2 sets of shoulders, 2 sets of biceps, 2 sets of triceps. I did 11 total sets today. But all of them, like other than the 3 buffalo bar sets, all of them are to failure.
So that's something that for me at least definitely is not intuitive. Like the idea of taking some of those assistance exercises to failure, I would assume that would be very fatiguing, but it's really not like at all.
Fatigue, the models of fatigue right now are still quite nebulous, but what we're seeing is that heavy weights are peripherally fatiguing. They fatigue the muscles. Light weights for high reps done to failure, of course, right? So heavy weight to failure, low reps, lighter weight to failure, high reps. Lighter weight to failure, high reps is more central nervous system fatiguing. So how do you decrease the central nervous system fatigue? You externally stabilize and you choose movements where the absolute load is lower. If you're able to do that, you don't carry as much fatigue. But that's also why those accessory movements, when you're heading towards a peak, what do you drop? You drop assistance work, right? So instead of 2 sets, you do 1 set. Maybe you take out an entire exercise because that's what's going to offload your CNS fatigue. And that's not, to me, that's not intuitive because immediately when I think high reps, I think metabolic. Immediately when I think metabolic, I think muscular fatigue, I think peripheral. But it's not, it's central fatigue. Your CNS is more burnt out by high reps. And your CNS is also burnt out more by more integrated movements. So high reps with internally stabilized movements that are typically whole body, right? So a high rep set of squats is going to be more fatiguing than a high rep set of hack squats. is going to be more fatiguing than a high rep set of lunges, which is going to be more fatiguing than a high rep set of leg extension from a central nervous system perspective. And then depending on what load you're using, there's going to be more peripheral fatigue the heavier the weight is. So you're probably going to be able to hack squat more weight than you will for a squat. Yeah. But then you're not going to be able to lunge or leg extension as much weight. So there's less fatigue there. So it's always a cost benefit conversation that you're having of what's the benefit to me? Like, what adaptation am I chasing? How efficacious is this implementation going to be versus what's the fatigue cost on the other end? Right? What's the return on my investment of fatigue?
Yeah. I don't know. It's been interesting because, again, like even just going through some of these like new strategies, the biggest one has just been the super low volume and utilizing top sets in assistance work, which for me, I haven't really done those things very much in the past, but yeah, it just,
I'll pose the question the other way.
Different.
I'll pose the question the other way too, right? What would why would we do more volume on something? Be to learn the pathway, learn the muscle, more practice in the movement, right?
Yeah.
Do you really need to practice a hack squat?
No, like it makes sense. It's just, I think that at least for me, a lot of the stuff that I've learned, read, conferences, books, all this stuff, a lot of that stuff talks about driving, volume. And even if you look at, like, let's say Louis and Westside, and like Louis is a smart guy, sometimes maybe how he communicates is a little confusing, but like he talks about Prilepin's chart, obviously, and I'm not super sold on that, but I mean, he talks about how, when the lifter stagnates, you increase volume. And then you look at I don't know, a lot of other coaching paradigms, they talk about a lot of volume being a catalyst for the base of your strength, which then is transmutated when you go into the peaking phase and all that stuff. And nowadays, it's, my perspective on that is a little different, and I'm kind of calling into question some of those things that I used to believe and make
that's
sense.
what you need to do. That's what you need to do. 100% of the time, you need to call into question what your beliefs are, and you need to challenge them. At every turn, you need to challenge them, because that's how you progress as a coach. That's how you get better.
Yeah, well, it's funny too, because I don't know where I heard this, but someone was asking me about like an article that I wrote or something like that a while back. And I'm like, oh God, I hate that article. And they're like, really? Why? But you wrote it. And I'm like, yeah, dude, like I read an article and then 6 months later, I'm like, oh fuck, I hate this. I'm so ashamed. You know what I mean? It's like, I do it differently. And I don't remember where I read this, but someone was like, if you don't look back on a program that you made like from 2 months ago or something like that and absolutely hate yourself, you're a bad coach. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense.
Tony and I just did a podcast about things we fucked up when we were younger. It was so good. I was like, I looked at one of my programs because I was going through, for one of my presentations on Coach's Corner, I was going through old athlete programs that I wrote to look at how I implemented plyometrics. And some of the fucking programs I wrote, I was like, how did these kids do well? Like, how did they do well?
Yeah.
Now I look at them and like, man, well, I could do this so much better now. And the reality is, well, the kids did get better. So why did they get better? And then you get into that question, like, was it really that bad? Maybe, maybe not. Right.
So that's where I think a lot of that stuff comes into play, where it's like, when people are talking about strength is developed at 85+% of 1RM, and you hear that and you're like, well, no, because these guys are all getting stronger. And it's like, I think a lot of those things are really only applicable to the people who have that skill development, where it's like their squat looks the same every time. Their deadlift, their bench, they're strong enough. Like they're now a fairly experienced athlete. They're quite strong. And so I think a lot of those, guidelines become a lot more relevant to those individuals, where specificity becomes exponentially more important, and transference and specificity overlap much more significantly than when you were maybe a novice or even an intermediate. And so, those finer points start to make much more difference, right? Even things like lifestyle. I remember when I was, fighting, I would train 6 hours a day, and I would work a full-time job, wouldn't really sleep, ate like maybe 100 grams of protein a day, and then like 900 grams of carbs or some crazy shit like that. And I was vegan, and I was doing all this weird shit, and I was just getting
Vegan.
better. Yeah, oh yeah, I was a vegan for like a year, and then like a vegetarian for maybe 6 months or a year before that as well. And I was in like terrible health because I didn't know what I was doing. I just basically was like, well, I guess I'm not going to eat animal products anymore. And then that was basically the extent of my research. And you know what I mean? Like I got away with so much, and I was an elite boxer, you know, and like an elite athlete. And
Yeah.
my conditioning was like top notch. I never got tired. And if if I miss like 70 grams of protein or 50 grams of protein now, I swear to God, I will feel differently the next day. I will not
Yeah,
feel
but that could also be a nocebo, right?
sure. I just mean like,
Yeah.
I just mean to say that little things affect me a lot more than now. You know, that
I've
I'm a little
been
bit stronger and I'm more aware of what's going on.
ever since we had our conversation with John Kiley about general adaptation syndrome and the idea of, an athlete's belief in the program and how that shapes outcomes. And he made a statement, and I think this might be a good way to end the podcast is he made the claim that the coach is the placebo. The coach being, if you have faith in your coach, if you believe that the coach's program is going to lead you towards success, that in itself is enough to cause a positive adaptation. Think about situations in which you thought you were doing the best thing possible for yourself. It usually ended well. Whenever you had questions about the validity of what you were doing, it usually ended poorly. So his concept is just the idea of the general adaptation curve, where you have like stimulus detraining, super compensation, response adaptation. He's like, the stimulus isn't as important to the adaptation as the belief of what the stimulus is going to do. So if you believe that this is what's going to help you and you do it, you'll get better, and vice versa. And now we're talking about like, okay, like, is this amount of volume appropriate and blah, blah, blah. Well, at that point of you being vegan and training 6 hours a day, you probably thought you were doing exactly what you needed to do. But now that you have the knowledge to know that it's not, if you tried to do it again, it wouldn't fucking work.
It's honestly crazy how
The mind shapes the body,
it's
right?
fucking bananas, man. It's so crazy.
You
It's
heard
like you would it's so funny that you would hear someone like John Kiley, like for those of you guys who don't know, like he was on the podcast, you check it out. It's a super interesting episode. Actually, your episode was really awesome as well, that you had him on as well, your podcast.
yeah,
But dude is super smart. He's a very, very elite sport coach. And this guy is saying that his program is less responsible for I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, yeah, my programming was at least equally responsible as the belief, you know, that
yeah.
they had in my program for producing results. And you're like, when you hear someone who's that level say some shit like that, you're like, okay, I need to take a minute to digest the implications of that statement, you know?
Yes. And I think it's 100% true. Because you hear these stories of like, guy takes a pill and thinks it's poison, ends up having a heart attack when in fact it was a sugar pill.
Yeah.
Right? Like that shit happens all the time.
Or the steroid placebo one. That one is fucking bananas too.
Steroids are definitely not placebo, let me tell you.
No. The
just fucking with you.
there was a paper a while back, and it was like, oh god, I can't remember exactly what it was, but essentially
I remember it was great.
yeah, it was like they had two control groups. One was given actual steroids, the other was given a placebo. They both produced like very similar results. Steroids produced slightly better results, but then they both told them they told one group, part of who had taken steroids, part of who hadn't, that they were taking a placebo the entire time. And then they told the other group, half of who did take a placebo, half of who didn't, that they were taking steroids the whole time. And so they kind of like unblinded them, supposedly. and even the people who were taking steroids saw a significant decrease in performance post training, post intervention, and then the placebo intervention continued making progress even after that, because they're like, oh, so I was taking steroids, and they just jumped right, and I was like, fuck, that's amazing.
Yeah,
Like,
man.
the placebo outperformed steroids, and I don't think that's obviously going to be ubiquitous, but it's enough to make you stop and be like, okay, this shit's crazy. Anyways, it's been an hour and a half. This was a super interesting conversation. I
Yeah,
feel like we
man.
kind of went a little bit away from the deadlift, but
Those are the
um,
best.
yeah, dude, super interesting conversation, man. Thanks a lot, brother. Oh, sorry.
Pleasure.
Before we end off, where can people
Yeah.
find you?
Yeah, man. So you can find me on Instagram at Paul Oneid or my website, www.masterathletic.com. You can also find me on Coach's Corner U, www.coachescorneru.com or Coach's Corner University on Instagram.
Awesome. So all that stuff's going to be in the show notes, guys. Definitely check that out. He's got a lot of great content. Coach's Corner puts out lots of great stuff as well. And thanks so much, Paul. I will talk to you later.
My pleasure, dude.